Okay, good morning everybody. Can I just do a quick sound check? Everyone hear me okay at the back? Yeah, okay, thank you. Well, it's great to see so many of you here this morning. Clearly there's a lot of interest in mobile microlearning and AI, which is good news from my perspective. My name is Mackman. I'm the technical director for a learning technologies company called Agylia. We're based with head offices just north of Bristol in the UK. We also have offices in North America as well. We've been in the learning technologies business for just shy of 20 years, actually. We started back in January 2000. Nice easy date for me to remember. It's been incredible to see the evolution of the technology that's been applied to learning during that time period. In this session, I'm going to be talking about mobile microlearning and AI, and really how one kind of builds on top of the other. Back in the day, mobile learning had a certain amount of uptake and was effective up to a point. Then came along microlearning and the sort of style of microlearning content creation and delivery, which really helped sort of turbocharge the use of mobile. And now we're at the point where AI technology is being applied on top of that to, for example, provide more personalized learning experiences than we've seen before. So kind of as you move through these levels, you go from sort of effective to the most effective with these three technologies applied together. So I've been talking about mobile learning for quite a number of years now, and it was quite important in the early years to sort of emphasize the point that mobile is really significant. I think it's less important these days, but I did just want to show one quick slide to just illustrate that the trend is just accelerating. If you look between 2017 and 2018, this UV is unique visitors, and 25% of all web access was done mobile only, and that's moved up to 32%, with desktop access and unique visitors going down from 11% to 6%. So that trend is absolutely continuing. So mobile really does need to be right at the forefront of any learning technology initiatives. So what about mobile and microlearning? Kind of what has fueled the demand for the microlearning style of content development and learning delivery? Well, it's a combination of factors, really. I've called out some of them. Popularity of video-based training. I mean, there's no doubt that video is incredibly popular. Platforms like YouTube, of course, fueling that. But it's an ideal form factor for mobile devices. So, a lot of the learning that we do, a lot of the development that we do is podcast-based and also video-based. I think these days it's fair to say that people generally have a lower tolerance for boredom. There's less time. There's more to do during the day. So there's less time to sort of step away and do formal, maybe classroom-based training. Of course, there is a time and a place for that, but microlearning can kind of really help where the training's been pushed out in small, bite-sized, consumable pieces that people can pick up and look at when they get spare 5 minutes, and then come back to and sort of carry on later on. There's definitely a lack of engagement with conventional learning. A lot of the large companies that we deal with, they've done a lot of surveys of their staff, and everybody I talk to kind of back this up. The conventional e-learning, the sort of 45-minute bit of point-and-click kind of stuff that you get on the web is not terribly engaging, generally speaking, and there's a demand to move on beyond that. Of course, there's a general expectation also for information to be on demand. You want to find something out, you go to Google, you quickly get an answer. Why should kind of corporate learning be any different to that? You want to provide instant access to information at the point of need, and that's where mobile, and mobile solutions really can win. And then there's the influence of the millennial generation, the kind of the expectation for everything to be mobile. But I wouldn't want to limit it and pigeonhole it to that particular generation. I think it's fair to say that most people these days, there is that expectation to have information on demand, have mobile devices at hand, and you want to make sure that the learning and development that you're providing is available on that form factor. So microlearning, I mean, we started building classroom training and e-learning, but recently our content development teams are pretty much exclusively involved in building microlearning, sort of breaking content down and making it more accessible in bite-sized, smaller pieces. And there are a number of benefits to this microlearning style of content development and delivery. There are benefits to the organization, which I'll talk about, and also, of course, benefits to the individual, which I'll come on to. From an organizational perspective, certainly it can be more effective at improving workforce performance. cheaper to build and easier to update. That's important, because things are moving so rapidly, businesses are changing, and circumstances are changing. So it's no good taking 3, 4, 5 months to build some e-learning, because by the time you finish that, it's probably out of date and you need to start again. Whereas with microlearning, it's easier to update because each granular piece can be updated independently, and it can be quite a lot cheaper to build as well, particularly if you get a production line process going. There are shorter development cycles, as I say, which is very important in this day and age. There's a broader and wider application for microlearning, I would argue, as well, because it can be used for both learning and learning reinforcement, learning development, but also performance support, where you want to provide that information on demand just in time. The same assets, if they're built right, can be used in both scenarios. So they can be combined to create learning programs and learning journeys and pathways where you want to get more sort of conceptual information across. But equally, it can be used for performance support and just-in-time information retrieval. So it has kind of a wide applicability in that sense. And certainly, I would say it meets the millennials' expectations. But as I say, I think it's pretty much everybody's expectations today, I would say. From an individual perspective, it's fair to say I think that it's more appealing than your sort of traditional click-through e-learning. It can definitely increase voluntary participation in e-learning, and we've seen this, because everything you do, you want to measure, and you want to sort of measure the engagement, and that's very important. And with this microlearning style of development, you can really kind of help get that voluntary participation up, so where people, if you're providing them with useful, relevant, just-in-time information, they'll go back and they'll want to find more. It's accessible anywhere on all device types, very important, requires less time away from work, which I would say is both a benefit to potentially the individual, but certainly the organisation as well, actually. And this one's important down here because for maximum benefit, the microlearning that you're delivering to individuals needs to be personalised. So you're giving people exactly what they need based on perhaps their job role or their circumstance or their current knowledge levels. So personalisation, when applied to this, becomes very important. But if we just take a step back and look at some of today's challenges that we're faced with in corporate learning and development, well, certainly there's a case of content overload. I mean, there's so much content out there. There are libraries that quite often are bought in for coverage as opposed to impact, because there are many good sources of quality information out there. But it's really the challenge is getting the right information to the right people at the right time, and that's where it gets difficult. Quite often in many of the larger organizations that we deal with, certainly we see too many platforms. It's like, well, where do you go to get the information you need? They're suffering from kind of multiple platforms, which in itself doesn't provide a very good user experience, and each of the individual platforms don't. And I would say more than anything else, on mobile, user experience is absolutely key, because there's a general level of apps that people are used to, from the consumer grade apps that they're using on their devices. It's no good providing a mobile learning app from your company if it's not at that same sort of level of quality, providing that same level of user experience. So we spent a lot of time working on our apps. We've been developing apps for a good number of years now, and the focus has always been on the user experience to try and get it to that sort of consumer level grade. So we write native apps. These are apps that are built for iPhones and iPads in the world of iOS, and also apps for Android. So I'm not talking here about web apps which try to be one thing to everybody, and quite often the user experience suffers as a result. So that's really important. There's generally, we find a kind of poor quality data, but data on individuals, profile data, it tends to be distributed around multiple systems, and if you're trying to personalize the learning experience, that can be challenging. And also, it's sometimes easy, I think, to fall into an L&D-centric view of the world rather than actually sort of flipping that on its head and looking at it from a user perspective. What is the end user experience like? So there's a number of challenges wrapped up in all of that, and we're just kind of starting to see how some applications of AI can help address some of these challenges. Now, I just wanted to just pause briefly and just give you a little bit of a sort of a background on what we mean by artificial intelligence and AI. If you look at the actual definition, the science of training machines to perform human tasks, you may come across that definition. Of course, there are many different definitions. And there are many applications out there today, things like self-driving cars, fraud detection, robotics, medical diagnosis. There are some fantastic applications of AI in the wider world. But, and this is the key but, in the world of L&D where we are right now, we're not talking about any of that. We're really talking at the moment about a couple of areas where elements of AI are starting to see the light of day. Firstly, the use of chatbots, which I'm going to come on and talk a little bit more about, which involves sort of natural language processing and algorithms to enable you to interact with the systems in a more sort of conversational style. And also machine learning, which is another kind of significant area that we're starting to see applications of in the world of A&D. But really, we've got to kind of put a fairly narrow lens on it. We're not talking sort of broader AI. We're really kind of talking about those two areas. So with the chatbots, as I mentioned, they offer a more conversational experience using natural language processing to mimic conversations with people. So it provides a kind of an interesting and potentially quite engaging way of interacting with the system. And I'll come on to some actual examples of that and what we've been doing with chatbots in the world of L&D in a few minutes. From a machine learning perspective, this is really how machines can learn from data. So this is all about the algorithms that can process and analyze data, identify patterns, and then take decisions based on the patterns that they identify within the data. So for this, you need a lot of data. And of course, the world we're living in today, you've heard the term big data. With all the data that's there, machine learning has some tremendous applications to enable some sense to be made from all of that data that now exists. So the chatbot applications that you could think of in terms of L&D, well, there's intelligent surveying. So rather than just sort of using surveys, you can actually use chatbots to effectively perform the job of a survey, but you can get better quality of data, which I'll come on to in a moment or two. Skills gap analysis is another one. We're doing a project at the moment in the healthcare sector where we've developed some apps which start by finding out some contextual background about the individual and their circumstances. And then that contextual background, which is obtained through a conversation with the chatbot, is then used to provide some initial set of recommended content to get them going based on their circumstances. So that's the first sort of example of personalization. Chatbots can also be used for search. And also to provide instruction and guidance. So, performance support scenarios where you need to know how to do something. You're new to a company, let's say. Well, talk to the chatbot, ask it a question, see if you can get the information that way. So some quite innovative examples of that I've come across. And machine learning, of course, we see that in the sort of commercial space with Amazon and Netflix, with personalized playlist generation. Machine learning also being used for content tagging and categorization, and that's really quite useful and quite important because the libraries of content are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The job of categorizing that content and tagging that content is huge. So having machine support to do that is very important. So let's just focus for a minute or two on the use of chatbots and conversational AI, as we can think of it as. There's really kind of this line ranging from sort of basic or scripted chatbots, which are, well, very basic. They kind of look for key phrases, and they can only react based on the phrases they recognize, and then they can provide some predefined responses. But moving on from that, we have a category of chatbot called intent recognizers, which improve the understanding of intent. So they've got a better idea, they've got better natural language processing engines behind them to understand what is being said in the conversation. Word relationships are taken into account, for example, and they have elements of machine learning built into them. Moving further up, we come on to the class of chatbot called the virtual agent, and these are now more capable of holding end-to-end conversations. And they can also connect to different systems to bring in additional data. Maybe you're in a support scenario, then the chatbot may know who you are based on the telephone number that you've used, or there's some other aspect. It can query the history associated with interactions that you've had with the company before, and they can use that and adapt the conversation accordingly. So we're getting cleverer there. And of course, right at the top of the scale, we've kind of got the human-like advisors, which is, they can basically understand and reason in the way that humans can. Of course, we're not there. We're not there at all. But the sort of chatbots that we've been working with, and the example I'm going to come on to, I would say kind of sits in the middle here. But the technology is evolving all the time, so they are getting more capable. And there are some really good examples out there. And the one I'm going to talk about is I would say, a pretty good example of how you can use chatbots within a mobile application to drive, as I mentioned before, this personalized learning experience. So skills gap analysis is another one. Actual delivery of microlearning, I've seen this used too through the chatbot interface. So this is where you can actually ask the chatbot questions about, I'm new to the company, how am I supposed to fill in my timesheets, or how am I supposed to book a holiday, or whatever it might be. Providing a chatbot type interface to answer those types of questions is quite an interesting idea. And the important thing about these as well is they can be embedded. These chatbots can be embedded in different applications. So they can actually be embedded in the line of business applications that your employees, for example, are typically using on a day-to-day basis. So they're there at hand when you need them in that regard. They can be used for repetition and learning enforcement, for surveying, which I'm going to come on to, and also search. There are two examples I'm going to go into a little bit more. As performance support tools, as I mentioned, and as a novel, interesting alternative to assessments and quizzes. But I think actually the survey alternative for a chatbot is quite an interesting one, because I think it's fair to say people are going to get fed up of getting surveyed all the time. I mean, you can't these days seem to contact a company without 5 minutes later getting a request to fill in a survey about how the sport's gone. So surveys are getting a little bit long in the tooth, and the use of chatbots I think is quite interesting too, as an alternative to that. And, as I said, can be placed in context in the flow of work, as Josh Bursin coined this phrase a few years back, talking about learning in the flow of work. That's really kind of important, because you don't want to have to sort of context switch and go off to some learning management system somewhere when you want to find something. You want it actually in the context of the applications you're using day in, day out. That's the concept behind learning in the flow of work. And chatbots kind of sit comfortably with that. So, what about the use of chatbots versus surveys? Chatbots are a very good compromise between surveys, which are, of course, electronic, very scalable. You can push them out to hundreds of thousands of users, no problem. Get all the data in. That's fine, hugely scalable. But they're never going to be quite as insightful as a one-on-one interview, for example, where a person's interacting with another person. Now, that's great. You're going to get a lot of insightful information from that conversation, but of course, that's not scalable. So chatbots kind of sit in between the two ends of that spectrum, because they can provide more insightful input and they can scale. They can provide, and they do provide, a more natural and engaging user experience. I mean, at the end of the day, everybody here, I'm sure, is using messaging apps all the time. We're using WhatsApp, we're using Messenger, so we're used to kind of interacting with the use of messages. So, from that perspective, the chatbots fit in quite nicely. And as I say, I think it's a more engaging user experience than the typical survey, the classic, oh, not another survey, please. Messaging is a natural way of communicating. Also provides opportunities for positive encouragement and feedback along the way, so it can be a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more personalized to the individual responses, as opposed to a static survey. And the natural language processing data, this is probably the most important factor actually, results in qualitative data in addition to quantitative data, so data based essentially on numbers. So the feedback on that type of data is generally better and you can do more with it, so it's more insightful. So there are a number of advantages there. And of course the other thing to bear in mind is that the conversations can improve over time. Our first use of the chatbot in this healthcare application that I was referring to, in this scenario for surveying, we're using it to find out background information about, it's a health care application for people who are looking after others, so care workers. And basically the initial conversation wants to find out a little bit about the conditions of the person that you're caring for. And of course it's possible every now and again a condition will come along that the chatbot hasn't previously encountered and doesn't know about. So being able to recognize that and being able to see those conditions that are talked about, perhaps that it hasn't come across before and maybe for which there is no content to be recommended, that's a learning point there. You need to sort of monitor that, keep a track of that, and then over time improve the chatbot, maybe fill the content library with additional content relating to the condition you haven't encountered before, and so the whole system kind of improves itself as you go on. So that's an important factor to consider. And the more data you get, the more usage you get, of course, the greater the opportunity for learning and improvement. So here's a little walkthrough of the personalization chatbot that I was talking about, so that we happen to have applied to a healthcare scenario. But essentially the idea is when our app first starts and you first register on the app, it actually encourages you and prompts you to engage in the conversation with the chatbot. It wants to find out a little bit more about you. And as a result of the conversation, and we do keep the conversations pretty short, it's a mistake to try and get too much too soon, because you don't want people kind of exiting the chatbot conversation midway through. So that's another key metric to look out for, actually. How many people are actually getting to the end of the conversation? And if that metric is going in the wrong direction, it would suggest that the conversations are too long. But essentially what we do, having had the conversation, a series of keywords that we're looking for come out of that. And what we then do is we feed those keywords into our catalog, and we search against the catalog based on the keywords that we found, and from that generate a set of personalized content recommendations. So we generate a personalized playlist. So our apps use playlists to deliver different types of content. Again, a very familiar construct from apps like Netflix and so forth. But these personalized playlists now contain content recommendations based on what you've discussed during a conversation. So the conversation in our example happens at the beginning, when they first log into the app and start using it, but also subsequently it will prompt every now and again to ask if your circumstances have changed. And if your circumstances have perhaps changed, it would encourage you to have a conversation again, to again further enable us to personalize content based on your circumstances. We also actually apply rating data, so individuals are able to rate the data, and we use that as another factor when it comes to recommending content, because we wouldn't want to recommend content that continually gets a bad rating. So, having that ability to allow people to rate content becomes quite important as well. Just on a side note on that, we've moved recently from a 5-star rating system, because we actually discovered that, maybe slightly surprisingly, but people don't actually tend to bother too often to give a 5-star rating, because it's surprising. It's only a little mental thing that you've got to think about, but it's like you suddenly got to think, hang on a minute, would I give that 4 stars, or would I give that 5 stars, or should I give it 3? And your 4 might be my 3. So that type of star rating system has its problems, and we've seen in practice it's actually quite hard to get people to rate content. But a like-based system, very simple like-based system. Do you like it or not? Boom, 1 click, done. 1 tap, I should say. We're on mobile, but 1 tap, that's it. You know somebody's liked it, and using those sort of metrics. We've found a lot more success with that, because you get a lot more input, and then you can immediately start to see which content is being found useful and is being liked. Other big platforms like Netflix have actually gone the same way, and they've moved from ratings to likes as well. So I think there's a lot of science behind that. But anyway, that's a slightly side issue. Another application, another interesting one for chatbots is the use of search, because regular search, of course, is fine, but generally what happens is you get far too many results. You get loads and loads of information, and the better search engines, of course, will give you content in the right order, give you results in the right order. But nevertheless, with LNG controlled chatbots, what we can do is we can help to focus the results more down to the individual. So, give you a little example. This is the interaction now with the chatbot. So, I need to improve my management skills. What training do you have? So, you're asking the chatbot about management training. And the chatbot can come back and it can search the catalogue and say, okay, I found 176 items. Are there any specific areas that you're interested in? I know I've been told I need to delegate more. I'm not very good at delegation. Need to get better at that. So now you're refining the search. Okay, my library now contains 15 items covering delegation. Would you prefer to read, watch video, or listen to your training? So now you're sort of querying the user about what form factor they would prefer. And in my case, yeah, I like videos, please. Give me videos. And then the search comes back and says, okay, 5 videos we have on the subject of delegation. Here's an example here about, we've asked this question, what type of content do you prefer? But of course the system, if it's gathering the data, it can look at you as an individual, knows who you are, and it can actually say, oh, well, actually, this person continually goes for the videos first. They've looked at a lot of videos, haven't looked at many, I don't know, podcasts, so we won't give them audio recommendations. So just a little example of where, again, with a bit of integration, the chatbot can become that little bit cleverer. But that's another little application of chatbot that could be quite effective for search. So, they're the two areas. The reason I've looked at the personalization through the use of chatbots and also search is because they're the 2 areas that kind of we've been working in most recently. And I would encourage anybody who's interested in what I'm talking about, which hopefully is all of you, but if you want to actually see the apps that I'm talking about, our stand, I should have mentioned this at the beginning, is just across the way, around the corner. So we're very happy, myself and my colleagues, to show you our apps. But from a recommendations perspective, how to kind of get going in the world of AI and mobile and microlearning, I think it's important to begin with a specific scenario. I think I've seen quite a lot of projects fail because they try to do too much too soon. I think it's really important to do a proof of concept, and that's kind of how we've started with our customers, doing proof of concepts. From a chatbot development perspective, and from the kind of the AI intelligence perspective, there is the choice to be made as to whether you build or buy. We've kind of done a bit of both. We work with a partner company who specialize in AI, and we also develop our own platform. So we've done a lot of custom integration working with the partner company. So we've kind of done a little bit of both. Really important, though, that you start with what we call an MVP. Any software people among you will know what that means, but that's minimum viable product. Basically, it means don't go building a great big solution and keep on building it, hoping that it's exactly what your users want. Get something really small out there early, and then start gathering the feedback, get the data, start learning from it. Even if it's a bit rough around the edges, get it out there early and then move on. That's really, really important. Otherwise, you can sink a whole lot of money into building something you think the people, your audience wants, and then you put it out there and you realize that's actually not what they wanted at all. So start with an MVP is a really important one. Any kind of solution like this needs to build on a proven mobile platform, and again, going back to UX, user experience being the key factor there. And also, we found also it's important to be transparent to the end user about kind of what it is you're using this chatbot technology for. So, because we've found in some situations still a bit of a reluctance to engage fully in a conversation. And we've also had situations where we've had people not necessarily realizing initially that they're talking to a chatbot as opposed to a person. So I think it's important to be quite clear, open, transparent about that and say what it is you're trying to get out of the conversation to encourage people then to engage more. And as I say, there's more you can do with connection and integration, which I kind of touched upon along the way. So, in summary, because I'm coming to the end, there's a lot to get through in 30 minutes, but AI is without a doubt a hot buzzword in the L&D spaces. I'm sure a lot of other people are talking about AI. Is it flavor of the month? Yeah, definitely, absolutely, no question about that. But is it a direction of travel? Is it here to stay? I would say, yeah, absolutely it is. And you've only got to look at the consumer space with what's going on with Amazon, Google, Netflix, and so forth. And learning technologies throughout the decades has always tended to follow suit. So it is here to stay. It's an important area to keep looking at. It has an awful lot of potential. But as I said at the beginning, it's very early days, and the use of AI in L&D is kind of pretty focused at the moment. And in fact, there we are. We're generally talking about chatbots and machine learning. So that brings me to the end of my session. As I say, if you would like to ask more questions or come and see us on our stand, have a look at some of our apps, you'd be more than welcome. But thank you very much for your attention.